Emma was born on a rainy evening in early October, the only child of Richard and Susan Miller. Their small town, surrounded by rolling hills and endless cornfields, wasn't known for much except its quiet pace and the way everyone seemed to know each other's name. Richard worked as a mechanic, his hands always blackened by oil no matter how hard he scrubbed them. Susan was a homemaker, though that word didn't capture the endless tasks she performed: cooking, mending, cleaning, and ensuring that Emma always had what she needed, even when money was tight. From the start, Emma was different. She had a restless energy that filled their modest house. And Susan often joked that her daughter was born with her eyes wide open, already searching for something beyond the four walls of their world. Richard loved to sit Emma on his knee when she was little and tell her stories about how cars worked, or why the stars shone brighter on cold nights. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he spoke, there was always a practical wisdom to it. Susan, on the other hand, filled Emma's childhood with warmth: bedtime stories, homemade cookies, and the constant refrain that kindness mattered more than wealth. For a while, Emma seemed to absorb these lessons. She hugged her parents fiercely when Richard came home tired from the shop, and she would sit at the kitchen table, asking Susan questions about recipes or life. But as Emma grew older, something inside her began to shift. By the time she was 12, she was already dreaming of bigger things. She devoured magazines about celebrities and successful entrepreneurs, cutting out pictures of tall skyscrapers and fashionable women with briefcases. She taped them to her bedroom wall, replacing childish posters with glossy visions of a life she wanted to claim. One evening, as Richard tucked her into bed, he noticed the collage. "What's all this then?" he asked, gesturing to the photos. That Emma's eyes lit up. "That's where I'm going to live one day, in a big city. I'll have a job where I wear suits, and people will know my name. I won't just stay here forever." Richard smiled softly, though a shadow crossed his face. "It's good to have dreams, sweetheart. But don't forget, no matter how tall those buildings are, the people inside them are still just people. And family. Family is what makes you strong enough to reach those dreams." Emma rolled her eyes. "You don't understand, Dad. I don't want to fix cars or bake bread. I want something more." He opened his mouth to reply, but then stopped, ruffled her hair, and simply said, "Get some sleep." Susan, overhearing the exchange, sighed quietly. She knew her daughter's spirit was too big for their little town. But it hurt to think that Emma might one day look at her parents the same way she looked at those peeling kitchen walls, as something outdated. Holding her back, as the years passed, Emma's impatience with her family life grew more obvious. Dinner conversations about local events or Richard's work felt unbearably small to her. She wanted to talk about opportunities, money, influence. When Susan proudly mentioned saving a few dollars at the farmer's market, Emma snapped. "What's the point of saving pennies when the world runs on millions?" Richard frowned, but didn't raise his voice. "Those pennies bought the shoes on your feet," he said simply. But Emma wasn't listening. She was already imagining herself far away, surrounded by skyscrapers and success. High school was Emma's launching pad. She wasn't the smartest in every class, but she was relentless. She volunteered for leadership positions, argued her way into debate tournaments, and charmed teachers into writing glowing recommendations. Her classmates admired her confidence, though some whispered that she was arrogant. Emma didn't care. She told herself that people only criticized because they didn't have the courage to dream big. Meanwhile, Richard and Susan bent their lives around her ambitions. Richard picked up extra shifts at the garage, sometimes working until his back ached so badly he could barely stand. Susan began selling homemade jam and crafts at weekend fairs, quietly adding the money to a savings jar. Emma never noticed. They never complained, because to them, love meant sacrifice, even if it went unseen. When the acceptance letter from a prestigious city university arrived, Emma burst into the kitchen waving the envelope like a trophy. "I got in," she shouted. Susan dropped the dish she was drying and hugged her tightly, tears filling her eyes. Richard clapped her on the shoulder, pride and exhaustion mingling in his expression. "We knew you could do it," he said. But instead of thanking them, Emma smiled triumphantly and said, "I told you I was meant for more." The night before she left, Susan cooked Emma's favorite meal: roast chicken with potatoes, green beans, and a homemade pie. She set the table with candles, wanting to create one last warm memory before the house grew quieter. Richard even bought a small cake, though it meant skipping his own lunch that week. Emma sat at the table, scrolling on her phone, barely tasting the food. Her parents shared stories, laughed, tried to draw her into conversation, but her mind was already in the city, imagining the dorms, the people, the endless opportunities to the end of dinner. Susan reached for her daughter's hand. Emma, wherever you go, remember that this home is always yours. We don't have much, but our love will always be enough. Emma forced a smile, nodding, though her thoughts whispered, love doesn't build skyscrapers. Love doesn't buy power. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Richard carried Emma's heavy suitcase to the bus station. His hands, rough and calloused, clutched the handle firmly, as though he could keep her close just by holding on. Call us when you get there, he said, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his emotions. Keep track of your money. And remember, not everyone you meet will have your best interest at heart. Be careful. I'll be fine, Dad, Emma said, hugging him quickly. Susan clung to her daughter a little longer, whispering, don't forget who you are. But Emma barely heard her. The bus engine roared, the doors closed, and she waved quickly before turning to face the future as the bus pulled away. Richard and Susan stood side by side on the platform. Richard shoved his hands into his pockets, staring at the shrinking vehicle until it vanished. Susan leaned into him, whispering, she'll come back to us. Richard didn't answer. He knew the city had a way of swallowing people whole, of changing them so much they forgot the ground they came from. On the bus, Emma leaned against the window, her heart racing with excitement. She didn't look back. She didn't see her parents standing there, small figures fading into the distance, clinging to hope as tightly as they had once clung to her tiny hands. For Emma, the future sparkled. The past was something she was determined to leave behind. What she didn't know was that life, in its quiet but relentless way, was already preparing lessons for her, lessons about love, sacrifice, and the true cost of forgetting where you come from. The city was everything Emma had imagined and more. Towering buildings glittered under the night sky, streets buzzed with energy, and people hurried past with a purpose that thrilled her. She felt alive here, as though every corner held an opportunity waiting for her to seize. University life came with its challenges, but Emma thrived. She quickly adapted to the fast pace, joining student organizations, volunteering for leadership positions, and surrounding herself with people who shared her ambition. She dressed the part too, no longer in simple jeans and t-shirts, but in sleek blouses, polished shoes, and a confidence that made her look older than she was. Her parents called every week, eager to hear her stories. At first, Emma answered enthusiastically, telling them about her classes, her professors, and the new friends she was making. Richard would listen carefully, sometimes not fully understanding the academic jargon, but proud all the same. Susan would remind Emma to eat well, to get enough sleep, to be cautious. But as time passed, the calls became shorter. Emma would answer while rushing between classes or meetings, distracted and impatient. When Susan asked gentle questions, "Are you eating enough, honey? Are you feeling lonely?" Emma sighed, "Mom, I'm fine. I don't have time for this." Richard, hurt by her tone, would sometimes take the phone, reminding her, "We just want to know you're okay." "I said I'm fine," Emma would snap. Before hanging up, back home, Susan stared at the silent phone in her hand, trying to convince herself that Emma was just busy, that this distance was temporary. Richard, however, remained quiet, worry etched into his weathered face. Meanwhile, Emma's world expanded. She befriended students from wealthy families, people who vacationed abroad and wore designer clothes without thinking twice. At first, Emma felt out of place, hiding the fact that her parents lived in a small town and struggled to pay for her tuition. But she quickly learned how to adapt, telling stories that made her sound more worldly than she was. She laughed at their jokes, mirrored their confidence, and gradually began to fit in. One evening, during a dinner with her new circle of friends at an upscale restaurant, someone asked casually, "So, Emma, what do your parents do?" Emma hesitated. Images of her father in oil-stained overalls and her mother selling jars of jam at the market flashed in her mind. A wave of shame washed over her, and before she could stop herself, she said, "My dad runs his own business." My mom's into crafts, kind of a small boutique thing. Her friends nodded, uninterested, and the conversation moved on. Emma exhaled in relief, but a pit of guilt lingered in her stomach. Later that night, when her mother called, Emma let it ring until it went to voicemail. She didn't want to hear Susan's gentle voice reminding her of the sacrifices that clashed so painfully with the image she was trying to project. Months turned into years. Emma excelled academically, earning internships at prestigious firms. She worked tirelessly, often sleeping only a few hours a night. Success fueled her, and she convinced herself she was on the right path. Her parents, proud yet increasingly distant, continued to support her in every way they could. Richard drove an old car long past its prime, refusing to buy a new one so he could send Emma extra money when she needed it. Susan cut back on groceries, telling Richard she wasn't hungry when, in reality, she was making sure there was enough saved for Emma's rent, but Emma rarely thanked them. In her mind, she was doing it all on her own. After graduation, Emma landed a job at a well-known corporate firm. The salary was higher than anything her parents had ever dreamed of earning, and she moved into a sleek apartment in the heart of the city. She bought new clothes, dined at expensive restaurants, and finally felt she was living the life she had always wanted. Yet with each step upward, the gap between her and her parents widened. She called less frequently, sometimes going weeks without speaking to them. When she did call, she was distracted, multitasking, her tone clipped point one evening. Susan called just to hear her daughter's voice. "Emma, it's been so long. How are you, sweetheart?" Emma sighed, staring at her laptop. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something. Can we talk later?" Susan hesitated. I miss you. "I know, but I'm busy. I'll call soon," Emma said quickly. Hanging up, Susan sat in the kitchen, the clock ticking loudly in the silence. Richard entered, saw her wiping her eyes, and placed a hand on her shoulder. "She'll realize one day," he murmured. "We just have to hope it's not too late." But Emma didn't realize. Not yet. Her career consumed her. She worked long hours, impressed her bosses, and gained recognition. She began dating Daniel, a charming young man from a wealthy family. He admired her drive and often told her she had potential to climb even higher. Emma clung to his validation, convinced that with him by her side, she was unstoppable. But Daniel was not what he seemed. He enjoyed the status Emma gave him, the ambitious girlfriend who could match his energy. Yet he lacked depth, and over time, his interest waned. He criticized Emma's background subtly, making remarks like, "You must be glad you got out of that small town. I can't imagine living like that." Emma laughed nervously, agreeing, though something inside her twisted. She told herself it didn't matter. What mattered was moving forward, not looking back. Her parents invited her home for holidays, but she always found excuses. "I can't take time off work. Flights are too expensive right now. Maybe next year." In truth, she didn't want to face the small, modest house that no longer fit the image she had built for herself. She didn't want her colleagues or friends to know where she came from. Years passed this way. Emma climbing higher, her parents waiting patiently for her return, until one night. Emma received a call that shattered her carefully built world. It was from a neighbor back in her hometown. Richard had collapsed at the garage. He was in the hospital, his condition serious. For the first time in years, Emma felt the ground beneath her shift. The skyscrapers, the luxury, the ambition, all of it blurred as reality crashed down on her. Her father, the man who had carried her suitcase, who had sacrificed silently for her dreams, was lying in a hospital bed, and she hadn't been there. Her hands trembled as she packed a bag. Daniel offered a half-hearted, "Do you really need to go back? Hospitals are depressing." Emma stared at him in disbelief, suddenly seeing the hollowness in his eyes. Without a word, she left. The train ride back to her hometown felt endless. She pressed her forehead to the window, memories flooding her mind. Her father teaching her how to ride a bike, her mother singing softly as she cooked, the warmth of their sacrifices. Guilt gnawed at her, sharper than anything she had felt before. When she finally arrived at the hospital, Susan was sitting by Richard's bed, her hands clasped tightly around his. Richard looked pale, fragile in a way Emma had never seen. "Dad." Her voice cracked. Richard opened his eyes, a weak smile forming. "You came." Tears spilled down Emma's cheeks as she sank into the chair beside him. "I should have been here. I'm so sorry." Susan stroked her daughter's hair, whispering, "You're here now. That's what matters." But Emma knew it wasn't enough. She had traded years of her parents' love for ambition, and now the weight of that choice pressed heavily on her. The following years shaped Emily in unexpected ways, pulling her both closer to her parents and farther away. After the revelations and conflicts that had marked her teenage years, she began to see her parents not only as the figures who raised her, but also as flawed individuals struggling with their own fears, disappointments, and hopes. This realization was at once comforting and painful. It meant she could understand them better, yet it also forced her to carry the weight of their humanity when all she wanted was the freedom to be herself. Her father, Michael, had softened considerably since the night of their explosive argument. He was less quick to enforce rules and more inclined to listen, though the shadows of his former rigidity sometimes crept back. Emily noticed this especially when he was stressed at work or when she spoke about her plans for the future. There were moments when his protective instincts overwhelmed his attempts at patience, and his words cut sharper than he intended. But for the most part, he tried, and his effort showed in small gestures, like asking her opinion during dinner or encouraging her to share what she was working on in school. Her mother, Claire, was the bridge that connected them. Though she had often played the role of peacemaker in the past, now she stepped into the role of guide, reminding both father and daughter that love could be expressed in listening just as much as in speaking. Emily felt drawn to her mother's quiet strength, even as she struggled against it at times, resenting how calmly Claire seemed to accept what Emily considered to be unfair limitations. Yet, deep down, she knew her mother's patience was not passivity but endurance. When Emily entered her final year of high school, the house seemed to shrink under the pressure of looming change. Every discussion about college, careers, and independence was charged with hidden anxieties. Emily dreamed of moving across the country to study art and literature, immersing herself in a world where she could express every part of her without judgment. But Michael clung to the idea of her staying nearby, where he could keep an eye on her, protect her, and ensure she did not lose herself in what he saw as a dangerous world. One evening, the tension came to a breaking point. Emily, exhausted after a long day of classes and part-time work, returned home to find her father waiting in the living room, her mother beside him, her eyes wary as if she already knew a storm was coming. Michael asked Emily to sit down, his tone deceptively calm. "We need to talk about your applications," he said, his hands clasped tightly together. Emily hesitated, then sat, her backpack still slung over one shoulder. "I've already sent them," she admitted, her voice steady but her heart racing. His face tightened. "Where?" "New York, Chicago, Los Angeles," she listed, trying not to flinch at the way his jaw hardened with each word. "I need to go where I can grow, Dad. Where I can find out who I am." The silence that followed was suffocating. Claire reached for Michael's hand, but he pulled it away, running his fingers through his hair as if trying to process what he had just heard. "Do you understand what those cities are like? Do you know what happens to kids who think they can handle it all on their own?" His voice rose, but this time it carried more fear than anger. Emily swallowed. "Yes, I've read, I've researched, I've prepared. But you don't get to keep me here just because you're scared." Her words landed heavily. For the first time, she saw tears in her father's eyes, a sight that shook her more than his shouting ever had. He leaned forward, his voice breaking. "I just don't want to lose you. You don't know what it's like to wake up every day wondering if the world will take your child away." Emily's breath caught. She had never considered the depth of his fear, had never framed his control as a form of desperate love. She sat in silence, unable to find words that could soothe the ache in his voice. It was Claire who spoke. "Michael," she said softly, laying a hand on his arm. "You're right to be afraid. We all are. But keeping her here won't protect her. It will only break her. Love means letting go, even when it hurts." For a long moment, no one moved. Emily felt the room tilt, her world shifting as she realized that her parents' fears were not walls to climb, but weights they carried. And she, too, carried them now. Over the next few months, the conversations grew less confrontational and more honest. Michael did not surrender his fears easily, but he began to share them instead of hiding them behind commands. Emily, in turn, learned to listen not only with defiance but with compassion. She wrote essays, painted canvases, and dreamed of futures far away. But she also sat with her father at night, asking about his childhood, about the mistakes he had made and the dreams he had abandoned. She began to see the boy he once was, the boy who had been taught that love was protection and discipline, not freedom. The day her acceptance letter arrived, Emily held it in trembling hands. She had been accepted into a university in New York, her top choice. Excitement surged through her veins, but so did fear. She found her parents in the kitchen, her mother chopping vegetables, her father fixing a loose cabinet hinge. She placed the letter on the table, her heart pounding. "I got in," she whispered. Claire's face lit up with pride, while Michael froze, his screwdriver clattering to the floor. For a moment, Emily thought he might forbid it, might tear the letter apart in anger or fear. But instead, he stepped forward, picked up the envelope, and held it with trembling hands. His eyes met hers, filled with conflict and love. "If this is what you want," he said slowly, "then we'll find a way to make it work. Just promise me you'll come home sometimes. Promise me you won't forget where you came from." Tears blurred Emily's vision as she nodded. "I promise." In that moment, she realized that the bond between parents and children was not about control or rebellion, but about learning to carry each other's fears, hopes, and love. They were tied together not by chains, but by threads, fragile, flexible, and unbreakable. The summer before she left was bittersweet. The house, once filled with arguments, now echoed with moments of quiet understanding. Michael helped her pack, sneaking small notes into her boxes with words of encouragement. Claire taught her recipes, insisting that food was a language of love she would always carry. On the morning of her departure, the three of them stood by the car, the air heavy with unspoken emotions. Emily hugged her mother first, then turned to her father. For a heartbeat, he seemed uncertain, then pulled her into a fierce embrace. "Go make your life," he whispered. "And when you fall, know we'll be here to help you stand again." As she drove away, watching her parents shrink in the rearview mirror, Emily felt both the thrill of freedom and the ache of leaving. She understood now that independence did not mean severing ties. It meant carrying them with her, woven into every choice, every risk, every dream. Her parents would always be part of her story, just as she would always be part of theirs. And in that truth, she found a strength that would guide her through the unknown roads ahead.